January 17, 1940. The North Sea is a desert of slate-grey water and bone-chilling mist, a place where the wind doesn't just blow, it screams with the weight of impending history. On the deck of a German U-boat, the air is thick, a suffocating mixture of diesel fumes, unwashed skin, and the metallic, electric tang of a storm brewing on the horizon. The men inside this steel tube are fueled by a singular, dangerous belief that the world of old empires is brittle, and that their corrupt steel is the only ultimate truth. They have been told by their leaders in Berlin that the industrial giants across the Atlantic are soft, a decadent people distracted by the comforts of a distant shore, a nation of shopkeepers and chess players incapable of the brutal sacrifice required for total war. But as the horizon swallows the sun, a low, subsonic hum begins to vibrate through the very hull of the submarine. It is not the sound of an enemy engine, but the distant, rhythmic throb of a machine that never sleeps. It is the sound of an awakening colossus, a logistical heartbeat that would eventually turn the vaunted steel of the Axis into rusted skeletons littering the dark floors of the world's oceans. To understand the sudden, modern collapse of a superpower's vanity, one must look back to the moments when the perceived strength of an empire met the cold, unyielding reality of American industrial resolve. History is not merely a collection of dates etched in marble, it is a ledger of resources, a tally of caloric intake, and the terrifying will to apply them. In the early 1940s, the German High Command looked at their panzer divisions and saw invincibility. They saw the paper tiger of the West as a fractured, democratic society incapable of unified, singular action. They were profoundly wrong. Today, we see a striking, almost haunting parallel in the Eastern theaters, where massive aircraft carriers, glistening with fresh paint, and endless columns of main battle tanks are paraded through squares as symbols of an unstoppable rise. Yet, like the overextended supply lines of the Wehrmacht stretching thin across the Russian steppe, these modern machines of war are finding that without the foundational soul of a free industry and the logistical backbone of a true global power, steel is nothing more than future scrap metal, waiting for the furnace. The German soldier of 1940 expected a short, glorious campaign defined by the sharp, lightning edge of the blitzkrieg. They were trained to believe in the quality of the individual machine over the quantity of the masses. They expected the American aimers to fold at the first sight of a Tiger tank's 88mm barrel. Instead, they encountered a terrifying, almost supernatural abundance. There is a documented account of a captured German officer, a veteran of the brutal campaigns in Poland and France, who was brought behind American lines. There, in a dusty command post near the front, he saw a freshly baked chocolate cake. It wasn't just a cake, it had been delivered to a frontline American foxhole specifically for a private's birthday, shipped across thousands of miles of submarine-infested waters. The officer sat in silence, his spirit breaking in a way that no artillery barrage could achieve. It wasn't the bullets that destroyed his faith in the Reich, it was the cake. This simple, sweet object became a recurring symbol of American abundance, a sign that while the German soldier was scavenging for moldy bread, horse meat, and frozen potatoes, the American democratic machine was so efficient, so overwhelmingly productive, that it could treat its soldiers to the luxuries of home in the middle of a muddy trench without breaking its stride. This was the logistics of freedom, a concept that remains the invisible ghost haunting every modern adversary who mistakes a large standing army for a powerful one. The data from the archives tells the story with the cold, surgical precision of a ledger. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States did not just outfight its enemies, it outproduced them to a degree that defied human imagination. They produced over 300,000 aircraft and 86,000 tanks. In contrast, the sophisticated but over-engineered German industry struggled to keep even a fraction of that number operational on any given day. The American Sherman tank was often mocked by German crews as a Ronson because it lit up every time, but for every Tiger the Germans built with artisan care, the Americans built 30 Shermans. They built them with the same interchangeable parts, the same relentless speed, and the same industrial soul. This same disparity is surfacing today. When we look at the headlines regarding the capture of Maduro or the stalling of Eastern naval expansion, we are witnessing the modern equivalent of that chocolate cake realization. A regime built on the suppression of information, the centralization of power, and the fear of the individual can build 1,000 tanks, but it cannot build the culture of maintenance, the decentralization of command, or the industrial resilience required to survive a sustained confrontation with a free society that breathes logistics. The transformation of the soldier's perception is perhaps the most tragic and telling element of the historical record. By 1944, the letters home from the German fronts changed from boasts of victory and the coming new order to whispers of a terrifying reality. The sky was no longer theirs. The ground was being reclaimed by a tide of American steel that seemed to replenish itself overnight. The aircraft carriers of the East today face a similar existential crisis. They look impressive in a harbor, their decks crowded with fighters, but without the decades of institutional knowledge, the deep-water experience, and the intricate logistical web that the U.S. Navy has woven since the desperate days of Midway, these massive vessels are little more than floating targets, expensive, hollow monuments to a pride that ignores the bloody lessons of the past. The capture of Maduro serves as the ultimate modern proof of this fragility. It is the moment the veil is lifted, revealing that the iron fist of a dictator is often attached to an arm of glass. It proves that when the pressure of true global accountability is applied, the structures built on corruption and showmanship crumble into the dust of history. As we look deeper into the belly of the beast, we see that the American weapon of choice was never just a gun, it was the wrench. In the shipyards of Richmond and the factories of Detroit, women who had never touched a rivet gun became the architects of a new world. They were not working under the tread of a firing squad, but for the promise of a future. This is the democratic edge. When a Chinese carrier sits idle because a single proprietary part cannot be replaced without a bureaucratic nightmare, or when a column of tanks is abandoned because the fuel was sold on the black market by a corrupt colonel, we are seeing the ghost of 1940 return. The Maduro regime, much like the crumbling administrations of the late war Axis, discovered too late that a cult of personality is a poor substitute for a supply chain. His capture was not just a military victory, it was a forensic demonstration of the failure of autocracy. It showed the world that behind the grand parades and the fiery rhetoric, there was nothing but hollowed-out institutions and a military that existed only on paper. The sound of the era was the sound of the assembly line, a rhythmic, metallic clatter that drowned out the speeches of demagogues. This sound is the anthem of democracy. It represents a system where the individual is trusted to innovate, where the sergeant on the ground has more power to make decisions than a general in a bunker miles away. The German tanks of the 1940s were masterpieces of engineering, but they were too complex to fix in the field. The American machines were designed to be repaired by a farm boy with a hammer and a dream. This philosophy of simplicity and abundance is what turns modern Eastern armor into scrap. In a high-intensity conflict, the side that can fix its tanks the fastest wins. The side that can feed its sailors the best wins. The side that values the life of the individual over the glory of the state wins. Historical records show that by the end of the war, the average American soldier was better fed, better clothed, and better equipped than any warrior in human history. This wasn't an accident, it was a choice. It was the physical manifestation of the idea that a free person is more valuable than 1,000 subjects. This ideology is the true superweapon. It is the reason why, despite the massive investments in Eastern aircraft carriers, the balance of power remains tilted toward those who hold the keys to the global commons. The carriers of a paper tiger are built for the ego of a leader, the carriers of a democracy are built for the security of a world. When those two philosophies collide, the result is always the same, a trail of broken steel leading back to a failed capital. As we reflect on the rusted hulls of the past and the scrap metal of the present, a larger, more poetic truth emerges from the fog of war. Freedom is not just a moral choice or a lofty philosophical ideal, it is a practical, industrial, and tactical advantage. The abundance of a democracy, symbolized by that humble, recurring scent of fresh bread in a war zone, the roar of 1,000 factory whistles, and the sight of a chocolate cake in a foxhole, creates a force that is impossible to replicate through decree, fear, or forced labor. The tanks that turn to scrap in the face of US forces and the carriers that fail to launch in the hour of need are the inevitable, mathematical results of a system that values the appearance of power over the substance of liberty. In the final analysis, the history of warfare teaches us that while a paper tiger may look fearsome when the sun is shining and the cameras are rolling, it dissolves the moment the real storm begins. True strength lies not in the cold steel itself, but in the warm, unyielding spirit of the free people who forged it, ensuring that the light of freedom continues to shine long after the scrap has been buried by the rising tide of time. The capture of Maduro is but a footnote in a much longer story, a story of how the world's most powerful illusions are always shattered by the simple, quiet reality of an American supply ship appearing on the horizon, carrying the weight of 1,000,000 dreams and the tools to defend them. The rhythmic, grinding sound of the assembly line is the heartbeat of a nation that refuses to sleep until the job is finished. In the winter of 1941, as the smoke cleared from the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, the world believed the American carrier fleet was a ghost of the past. They saw a nation stand, its naval power resting on the silt of a shallow harbor. But they did not see the shipyards. They did not see the thousands of workers, men and women alike, who descended upon the steel mills with a fury that no dictator could command. This is where the myth of the paper tiger begins to bleed into the reality of the steel giant. The Japanese Empire, much like modern Eastern powers, calculated their victory based on what was visible, the number of hulls in the water on a Tuesday morning. They failed to calculate the invisible, the American capacity to rebuild, replace, and respond. By the time the tide turned at Midway, the American Navy wasn't just fighting with ships, they were fighting with a philosophy of resilience. A Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bomber is a simple machine compared to the elegant, deadly Zero, but the Dauntless was built to survive. It was built with the understanding that the pilot, the individual, was the most precious cargo. This is the fundamental rift between the democratic machine and the autocratic one. In the East today, we see aircraft carriers that are marvels of stolen technology and sleek lines, yet they lack the blood memory of the Pacific. They lack the thousands of hours of damage control drills, the decentralized leadership where a 19-year-old sailor is empowered to save a ship, and the logistical tail that stretches halfway around the globe. When we say these carriers turn to scrap, we aren't just talking about a missile strike, we are talking about the inevitable mechanical and systemic heart failure of a regime that does not trust its own people. Consider the tank, the iron fist of land warfare. In the scorched sands of North Africa and the hedgerows of Normandy, the German Panther was a terror. It was a technological apex predator. But it was brittle. It required specialized mechanics and rare alloys that the right could no longer secure. On the other side of the line, the American Sherman was ubiquitous. It was the everyman of the battlefield. It was designed with a recurring symbolic object of American democracy, the standardized bolt. Every bolt on a Sherman could be replaced by a bolt from a truck, an ambulance, or a sister tank. This standardization is the physical language of equality and efficiency. Today's Eastern armor, despite its reactive plating and digital displays, suffers from the same Panther trap. It is over-engineered for parades but under-supported for the grueling, muddy reality of a prolonged war of attrition. The capture of Maduro wasn't just a political shift, it was a demonstration of how quickly the iron fist loses its grip when the logistics of fear are met by the logistics of freedom. Maduro's fall serves as a mirror to the final days of the high-ranking officials in the bunker. It proves that when you build a military based on loyalty to a person rather than a constitution, the entire structure is a house of cards. The soldiers under such a regime are not fighting for a future, they are fighting to avoid a past. When the US forces move, they do not just bring firepower, they bring a terrifying clarity. They bring the realization that the mighty military the people were forced to worship is actually a hollow shell, emptied out by years of corruption and the siphoning of resources into the pockets of the elite. The tanks in the streets of Caracas didn't stop the change, they merely sat as silent witnesses to the obsolescence of tyranny. The sound of American freedom isn't always the roar of a jet engine, sometimes, it is the quiet, persistent clinking of a supply chain that never breaks. It is the sound of a C-17 landing on a dirt strip in the middle of nowhere, carrying not just ammunition, but blood plasma, fresh water, and mail from home. This is the abundance that breaks the enemy's will. During the Battle of the Bulge, German soldiers who were freezing and starving found American supply caches filled with high-quality winter gear and, most shockingly, fresh fruit. The psychological impact of a paper tiger realizing his opponent has so much excess power that he can shape oranges to a blizzard is the moment the war truly ends. As we look toward the horizons of the future, the lesson remains unchanged. You can build a carrier, you can weld the steel, and you can paint the numbers on the hull. But you cannot manufacture the soul of a sailor who knows he is fighting for his own liberty. You cannot replicate the industrial depth of a nation where the factories are owned by the people and fueled by innovation rather than decree. The aircraft carriers of the East will continue to rust, and their tanks will continue to stall, because they are built on the fragile foundation of an ideology that fears its own shadow. The capture of Maduro is the period at the end of a very long sentence. A sentence that began in the shipyards of 1940 and continues to be written today, that the abundance of a free people is the only true superpower. The epilogue of this great struggle is written in the scrapyards of history. There, the proudest machines of the dictators lie in tangled heaps, reclaimed by the earth. They serve as a poetic reflection on the nature of power. True power does not scream from a podium, it hums in the background of a free society. It is found in the abundance of the grocery store, the freedom of the press, and the resilience of the individual. As long as the chocolate cake of democracy can be delivered to the furthest corners of the earth, the paper tigers will always find their end in the fire of a reality they were never prepared to face. Freedom is the ultimate logistics, and in the end, it is the only force that truly endures.